The smell of wood smoke and cold pine sap rolled off the Montana hills like a warning. It was the kind of October morning that pressed down on a man's chest and reminded him how alone he truly was, how thin the walls of a cabin could feel when there was only one heartbeat that mattered sleeping inside. Abel Crane stood on his porch with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, watching the road that wound down from Bitter Creek, and he thought about the advertisement he had placed in the Helena paper 3 weeks ago. He had not told a soul in town. He was not a man who invited opinions. He was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands that had been broken and healed, and broken again by this land he loved and sometimes hated. His wife, Margaret, had been dead 2 years come November, taken by a fever that moved faster than any doctor could ride. She had left behind their daughter, Lily, who was 5 years old now and had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn silence. Abel could rope a calf, mend a fence line in driving sleet, and coax water from the most reluctant well in the territory. He could not braid a little girl's hair. He could not make the small sounds a child needed to hear before sleep. He tried. Every night he tried, and every morning Lily woke with tangles in her hair and a look on her face that was too old for 5. So he had written to the paper, 6 sentences. He was not a man for ornament. He owned 300 acres of good grazing land east of Bitter Creek. He needed a capable woman willing to keep house and help raise a daughter. He was offering honest wages, a clean room of her own, and a legal arrangement if both parties found it agreeable after a fair trial period. He had signed it with his name and the ranch's postal address and nothing else. 19 women had written back. He had read every letter at the kitchen table after Lily was asleep, and he had answered 2. One woman had written again to say she had reconsidered. The other had not written back at all. And then, 2 days ago, a short letter had arrived on pale blue paper in a firm, unadorned hand. Her name was Cora Marsh. She was coming anyway. She had already bought her ticket. The coffee had gone entirely cold. Down the road, a wagon was raising dust. The woman on the wagon seat sat straight-backed, which Abel noticed first. She wore a gray traveling dress that had been mended at the left cuff, which he noticed second. She had a single trunk lashed behind the seat, and no one with her. When the wagon pulled up to the gate, it was old Silas from the livery, squinting against the wind. The woman stepped down before Silas could offer a hand, and she looked directly at Abel with gray eyes that were neither warm nor cold, only steady. "Mr. Crane," she said. It was not a question. "Miss Marsh." He came down the porch steps and stopped 2 feet from her. She was younger than he had expected, maybe 28, with dark hair pinned tightly back, and a jaw that said she was accustomed to holding things in. "You said you were coming. You came." "I said it in writing," she agreed. "I keep my word." She looked past him at the cabin, then at the corral, then at the hills, taking inventory the way a sensible person inspects a situation before committing fully. The advertisement said a clean room of my own. "It is clean," he said. "I cleaned it myself." Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. It was not quite a smile. "Then I expect we should begin." Old Silas touched his hat brim and did not linger. He was already forming the sentences he would carry back to town, Abel knew. By sundown, the gossip would be running like creek water through every parlor in Bitter Creek. Cora pulled her trunk from the wagon bed herself, gripping the leather handle without ceremony, and Abel took the other end without being asked. They carried it up the porch steps together, neither of them speaking, which was the most comfortable he had felt in months. The cabin was 2 rooms and a loft. The kitchen was wide and practical, with a good iron stove and a window that faced south, which meant decent light most of the year. Cora set her end of the trunk down in the doorway of the spare room and looked at the window, the bed frame, the small shelf he had installed the day before. She turned back to face him. "What does she like?" Cora asked. "The girl." Abel was quiet a moment. No one had asked him that. "Frogs," he said finally. She likes frogs and she likes the color yellow and she doesn't like loud voices. Cora nodded as though he had given her something useful. Where is she now? School. He pulled his watch. 2 hours. Then I'll have the stove going and something hot by the time she gets back. Cora turned to her trunk and began unlocking it, and that was that. The matter was decided. She was here, and she was already at work, and the cabin felt, for the first time in a very long time, like it might survive the coming winter. Abel went back outside to his fence posts. He did not know what he had expected exactly. Something harder, maybe, or something softer. What he had not expected was someone so relentlessly practical that practicality itself began to feel like a kind of grace. The stove was going when Lily came home, which meant warmth reached the door before anything else did. Lily was small for 5, fine-boned and careful with her movements, the way children become when they have learned that the world does not always hold still. She stepped into the kitchen and stopped. She looked at Cora, who was stirring a pot of potato soup and did not make any sudden moves or loud exclamations of delight. She just looked back at Lily, with that same steady gaze she had turned on Abel at the gate. "I'm Cora," she said simply. "I'm going to be helping here for a while." Lily stared. Then she said, with the precise seriousness of a 5-year-old delivering a verdict, "Do you like frogs?" Cora considered this the way a judge considers testimony. "I think frogs are interesting," she said. "I've never had occasion to know one personally." Lily's face did something complicated. She hung her coat on the hook by the door. The hook was too high, but she had learned to jump for it, and she sat at the kitchen table and watched Cora work. She did not go outside. She did not go up to the loft. She sat and she watched. And Abel, standing in the doorway with sawdust on his coat, thought that this was the most attentive he had seen his daughter since Margaret died. Dinner was potato soup with dried salt pork and cornbread, and it was the best meal Abel had eaten in 2 years. He knew that was a low bar and suspected it nonetheless. Lily ate every bite and asked for more bread. When Abel told her to say please, she said please, without being sulky about it, which was unusual enough that he looked at Cora to see if she had somehow arranged it. Cora was watching her bowl. After dinner, when Abel was washing up, he heard Lily's voice from the next room, small and deliberate. "My mama used to put a ribbon in my hair." He went very still at the sink. Cora's voice came back, unhurried. "I have a yellow one in my trunk. Yellow's your color, I think." The water in the basin went cold, and Abel did not move to reheat it. 3 days passed, and then a week, and the rhythms of the cabin shifted the way soil shifts when a new season begins, slowly, and then all at once. Cora rose before the sun. By the time Abel came down from the loft with sleep still in his bones, the fire was built, the coffee was on, and there was generally something wrapped in a cloth on the warming shelf, biscuits, or a wedge of cornbread, or once, memorably, an apple turnover made from a half-bushel of windfalls she had spotted behind the barn. She was not a woman who explained herself. She did not say, "I noticed you haven't been eating breakfast," or "I thought this might help." She simply made the thing and left it where it would be found, the way a careful person leaves a lantern lit. Abel noticed. He said nothing. But he began to leave the fire banked lower at night, so she would have less to do in the cold dark of 4 in the morning. And once, when he split the week's firewood, he stacked it closer to the kitchen door than he usually did. He said nothing about that either. Some understandings are built without words, the way a dry stone wall is built without mortar, each piece fitted to the next until the whole thing holds. The town of Bitter Creek noticed in a different fashion. On the 8th day, Abel drove Cora to the general store for flour and baking powder and a few other provisions she had identified as absent from the cabin with the thoroughness of a quartermaster. Harlan Beek, who ran the store and everybody's business along with it, watched them come in with eyes that had been sharpened by years of watching. His wife, Dolores, was supposedly in the back arranging stock, which meant she was listening through the curtain. Mr. Crane, Harlan said, drawing out the name the way a man draws a card from a deck. And who is this? Cora Marsh, Cora said, before Abel could answer. She set her list on the counter. Flour, baking powder, salt, dried apple, and lamp oil. She looked at Harlan steadily. In that order, if you please. Harlan blinked. He was not accustomed to being organized. He filled the order in something close to the order she had requested, and he watched them with a sideways curiosity he did not bother to conceal. You staying out at the Crane place, Miss Marsh? He asked. Keeping house? That is the arrangement, she said. She did not elaborate, and her tone suggested elaboration was not on offer. Outside, loading the wagon, Abel told her, by tonight the whole town will know. I expect so, Cora said. She lifted the flour sack herself. Does that trouble you? He thought about it honestly. No, he said. Should it? She looked at him from across the wagon bed, a look that assessed something he could not quite name. Only if we've something to be ashamed of, she said, and I don't believe we do. He put the last sack in and climbed to the seat. No, he said again, we don't. It was the longest conversation they had managed that wasn't about Lily or fence posts, and it stayed with him the whole ride home, the way a good song stays, turning over quietly in the mind, without demanding anything. What the town made of it was less quiet. Mrs. Adelaide Foss, who sat on the church committee and considered this a position of civic authority, came to call on the Thursday of the second week. She arrived in a buggy driven by her son Ned, who waited outside with the studied patience of someone who had made this kind of waiting a profession. Mrs. Foss was 60, stout, and capable of delivering concern with the efficiency of a postmaster. She sat at Abel's kitchen table and accepted the cup of tea Cora poured for her, and then set it aside, because refusing would have been rude, and drinking it would have implied approval. Mr. Crane, she said, folding her hands, the situation you have arranged here is, shall we say, irregular. Abel sat at the head of the table and said nothing. The child, Mrs. Foss continued, cutting a glance at the loft where Lily was napping, needs a proper family situation, not an arrangement. She put the word on the table like something faintly soiled. Cora was at the stove. She turned around, not quickly, and set the ladle across the pot. Mrs. Foss, she said, the child had a hot breakfast and a clean dress, and her hair braided this morning. She has eaten well every day this week, and she slept 8 hours last night, which Mr. Crane tells me is more than she's been managing. She is not suffering from the arrangement. She said the last word back in exactly the same register Mrs. Foss had used, precise as a mirror. Mrs. Foss's chin came up. The matter of appearances, Miss Marsh. Appearances are for people with nothing more practical to worry about, Cora said, not unkindly. Then she turned back to the stove. There was a silence of considerable weight. Abel looked at his own hands on the table and felt something shift in his chest, small and distinct, like the click of a latch finding its seat. He looked up at Cora's back and then at Mrs. Foss and said, I think you've had a long drive, Adelaide. I hope the road home is better. Mrs. Foss left. The buggy was gone before Lily came down from the loft, rubbing her eyes, with the yellow ribbon still holding her braid. The first real storm of the season came in November, sweeping down from the Canadian side, with no more apology than a hammer needs for striking a nail. Abel had felt it building in his bad knee 3 days prior, and had spent those days cutting and hauling wood with the efficiency of a man who has faced Montana winters long enough to respect them. He had reinforced the barn, checked the roof, and laid in enough provisions that a siege of 2 weeks would not see them wanting. What he had not planned for was Lily's fever. It came on the second night of the storm, sudden and sharp, the way a child's fever tends to rise, from warm brow to genuine alarm in a matter of hours. Abel sat at the edge of Lily's small bed in the loft, pressing a damp cloth to her forehead, and felt the particular cold dread of a parent who has already lost one person to a fever in the night. Cora came up the ladder with the lamp, and she took one look at Lily and one look at Abel, and she said, "Move," not harshly, but with the clean authority of someone who knows what needs doing. She sat on the bed and she felt the fever herself, and she checked the child's breathing, and she began to speak to Lily in a low, even voice, telling her small things, about the soup she was going to heat, about the way snow looks on the window glass, about a dog she had known once that could sneeze on command. Lily's eyes opened and focused on Cora's face and did not leave it. Abel went down and built the fire up and heated water and did the things he was told to do, because having a task was better than standing in the loft with his heart in his throat. He heard Cora's voice the whole time, steady as a ticking clock, never rising, never falling into the false brightness that frightened children who are old enough to recognize fear, dressed in cheerfulness. By midnight, the fever had broken. By morning, Lily was asking for cornbread and complaining that the snow was too deep to look for frogs, which Abel took as evidence of a complete recovery. He brought Cora coffee at the kitchen table where she was sitting very still, with her hands around the mug, looking out the south window at the white world. He sat across from her. "Thank you," he said. She looked at the table. "She's a good girl." "She is," he agreed. "She likes you." Cora was quiet. Then she said, "I like her." She said it simply, without performance, which made it land the way simple, true things always land, heavy and clean at once. Abel turned his coffee mug in his hands. Outside, the wind hammered at the eaves and then relented, the way it does when a storm is learning to be finished. "The arrangement," he said carefully, "the one we wrote in letters." Cora looked up. "It doesn't have to stay what it was," he said. He was not a man who found words easily, and these came out rough at the edges, but they came. "If you wanted something more settled, legal." He held her gaze, which cost him something, because she had the kind of eyes that made a man feel thoroughly red, not as an arrangement, as an intention. The fire spoke in the stove. The wind made a long sound at the window. "Are you asking me?" Cora said carefully. "Because of last night?" "I'm asking you because of every night and every morning since you came," he said, "and because Lily braids her own hair now, because you showed her how, and because this house has been warm in ways it wasn't before, and because I think you might—" He stopped, started again. "I think you might have intended to stay all along, and I'd rather it be chosen than assumed." Something in Cora's face went quiet in a different way, not the closed quiet of a person guarding themselves, but the open quiet of a person arriving somewhere unexpected and finding it better than they feared. "I grew up on a Kansas farm," she said. "Dry land, debt that never quit. I came here because your advertisement was the most honest thing I had read in years. No promises, no fine words, just, this is what I have, this is what I need, here is what I offer." She looked at him steadily. "I can work with a man who says what he means." Abel held her gaze. "I mean to make it permanent, if you're willing." "I'm willing," Cora said. She did not look away. "On one condition." "Name it." "Lily gets to choose," she said. "You hear what people are saying in town, that you decided, that you arranged. Let it be hers too. She's old enough to know her own mind." Her chin was firm. "If she says no, then I'll go. And if she says yes, then we do this properly, in front of whoever will say the words." Abel looked at her for a long moment. He thought of everything he had watched her do in 5 weeks, the ribbon, the soup, the midnight vigil, the way she had faced Mrs. Foss without spite and without backing down. He thought of Lily's face at the kitchen table on that first night, watchful and waiting and slowly, carefully, deciding. "I already know what she'll say," he told Cora. "Then it costs you nothing to ask," she said. He went up the loft stairs. Lily was sitting up in her blankets with a cup of warm milk, and the look of a person who has recently survived something and feels notable about it. Abel sat on the edge of the bed. He took a moment, because some things deserved their moment. "Lilybug," he said. "I need to ask you something important." She watched him with her mother's eyes. "You know Cora," he said. "You know how she is. I want to know what you think of her staying, not as our helper." He chose the word carefully, the way he chose footholds on uncertain ground, as family. Lily wrapped both hands around her cup. She thought about it with the genuine seriousness of a child who has not yet learned to hide her thinking. Then she said, "Does she want to?" Abel said, "She does." Lily considered this a moment longer. Then she looked down at her cup and back up at her father and said, with the certainty of someone who has been quietly deciding this for 5 weeks, "She already is." Abel came back down the stairs. He stood in the kitchen doorway. Cora was at the stove, her back to him, and he noticed for the first time that she had added a small bunch of dried late-season wildflowers to the jar on the windowsill, a thing so small and so exactly right that it hit him like a physical thing. She said yes, he told her. Cora turned. Her eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, but with something adjacent to tears, something that had been held back a long time and was now, carefully, being allowed. "She said more than yes," Abel told her. "She said you already are." A sound moved through Cora then, quiet and involuntary, a small release, like a roof settling after a long storm has finally decided to be over. She pressed her lips together, and then she let out a breath and nodded, because some things do not require more than a nod. Abel crossed the kitchen. He stopped in front of her, close enough that the warmth from the stove was behind her, and the cold from the window was behind him. He was not a man of easy gestures, but he raised one hand and set it carefully against her jaw, his rough thumb at her cheekbone, and she did not move away. "We'll have Reverend Pitts say the words on Sunday," he said. "Sunday," she agreed. "The town will talk," he said. "They've been talking," she said. "Let them," they said, together, which surprised them both enough that something almost became a laugh, and in Abel Crane's kitchen, with the stove going and the snow thick on the ground outside, and Lily upstairs finishing her milk, that almost laugh was the most beautiful sound that house had heard in 2 years. The Sunday was cold and bright, the kind of day Montana produces in late November, like an apology for everything that came before. Reverend Pitts said the words in his parlor because the church was too cold to heat for a small wedding, and the witnesses were old Silas from the livery, who seemed genuinely moved, and Mrs. Hargrove, the schoolteacher, who cried with the uncomplicated joy of a person who still believes in simple goodness. Lily stood between Abel and Cora and held both their hands, and when the Reverend asked if anyone knew cause why the union should not proceed, Lily said very seriously, "I don't," which made Reverend Pitts cover a smile with his Bible. Harlan Beek heard about it by evening and told his wife that it was peculiar. Dolores Beek told him to hush and said it was about time, and they argued about this for 20 minutes in a way that was almost affectionate. Mrs. Adelaide Foss, when told, said nothing for a moment and then said, "Well, the child seems settled," which, from Adelaide Foss, was the next thing to a benediction. Abel built a second chair that winter. He had meant to build it sooner and kept putting it off, the way a man puts off anything that requires him to admit what he is hoping for. It was a plain chair, solid as the other one, and he set it at the kitchen table across from his, and he did not say a word about it. Cora sat in it every morning from then on, and she never said a word about it either. That was the whole of the conversation, and it was enough. When spring came and the ground softened and the creek ran high with snowmelt, Lily found a frog in the mud near the barn and brought it inside on a piece of bark, and Cora looked at it with the serious expression of someone fulfilling an obligation and said, "Well, now I know one personally." Lily laughed the way children laugh when the world is exactly right, loud and entire and unheld, and the sound of it went up into the rafters of the cabin where it stayed, Abel thought, like all the best sounds do, not leaving, only settling into the walls, becoming part of what the house was made of. There is something that ought to be said directly to you now, friend, before this story is finished. You have heard tonight about a man who wrote 6 plain sentences in a newspaper and changed his whole life, and a woman who bought a train ticket before she had any guarantee of welcome, and a 5-year-old girl who looked at a stranger stirring soup and decided, in the honest way of children, that this was someone who would stay. None of them used grand words. None of them made great speeches. Abel built a chair. Cora braided a child's hair. Lily said, "She already is." That was the whole of it, and that was enough, because a home is not built of timber and promises. It is built of small acts repeated until they become the shape of a life. Perhaps you know someone who built a home that way, or perhaps you are building one now, stone by patient stone. If you do, this story was meant for you. Tell me in the comments, have you ever witnessed a family made by choice rather than blood, the way Lily chose Cora? I would love to hear your story. If tales like this one speak to your heart, please subscribe for more journeys through the Old West, where ordinary people found extraordinary grace. Good night. God bless you and everyone you hold dear.